You're listening to the ESO Network, your station for all things geek.
Hey, music lovers, welcome back to Modern Musicology. You have in your ear holes Rob Levy.
Hello.
Anthony Williams.
Howdy.
And I am R. Alan Seiler, and we are bringing to you this week a very special guest with a topic that we're really excited to dig into. So, Rob, do us a favor and introduce our guest.
So we are joined by Rob Drew, professor of communication at the Saginaw Valley State University. He also studied media and communication studies at the University of Pennsylvania, Penn, don't mess with Franklin, studied English at Columbia University, and he now lives in the mean streets of Saginaw, Michigan. And his latest book is out. It's called Unspooled, How the Cassette Made Music Shareable. It's out on Duke University Press. First of all, thanks for coming on the show. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Rob. Thanks so much for having me.
I guess the general sort of lead question is, can you just kind of talk about how the book came about and sort of your journey to writing the book?
It's been a long journey, and I think I started thinking about cassettes and thinking about writing about them maybe 30 years ago, believe it or not. But my initial thought back then was I was making mixtapes, just like everybody back then. This was the 90s. And I just thought it was kind of a special thing that people were collecting music, collecting their favorite songs on tape, and then often giving it to another person as an expression of something. Could be love, it could be look at how great my tastes are, or anything in between. So I was interested in that as a form of communication. And the more I looked into that, and by the time I really got around to studying it, most people were making mix CDs already. But they kept talking about tape and how important cassettes were to them. So I decided to expand the project out, and over these several decades, it's expanded out into a little bit of a history of cassettes as a way not only of redistributing music that others have made that you love, but also for some artists back in the day of distributing music firsthand that you've made and want to get out there.
As someone who's kind of going through boxes and boxes of old cassettes and radio shows, and I'm finding all these like tons of cassettes from like local bands and bands that sent me stuff. It really is interesting how it sort of shaped music sharing now in many ways. Can you just kind of talk a little bit about sort of how the cassette, and you dive into this much more in the book, but can you kind of jump into how the cassette tape sort of like kick-started this idea of music sharing? Because you weren't no longer taking your Beatles records over to your friend's house and leaving them or anything. You were just handing them a cassette.
Oh, yeah, definitely. So sharing both is a way for, as you say, your friend's band sharing their music with you, but also sharing as a way of sharing your tastes and things like that. And that was pretty much not done prior to cassettes coming along. Maybe some people definitely did do it with reel-to-reel tapes and things like that. People made mixtapes on reel-to-reel tapes, but it was very rare. And in the 70s, in the 80s, it kind of became ritualized, so that by the 1990s already, there are representations of it and accounts of it in popular culture. We all know all the mixtapes flying around in a book like High Fidelity or a movie like High Fidelity, or in certain other books, or even songs about mixtapes. You could make a whole mixtape from the songs about mixtapes. So yeah, definitely sharing via a medium, being able to share your tastes, going right up until today. I mean, I usually talk about this toward the end, but we could talk about how nowadays people share their tastes all the time just by sharing links, texting somebody a link to something or sharing links on social media. I really think in some ways of mixtapes as being the beginning of that, of the idea of being able to share your taste, which we do on a daily basis now.
I think a lot of people are so unused to that idea. You know, when you do just send a link to somebody, whether it be a link to a song or a playlist or whatever, that the whole idea of music is as a shareable medium. And it's a foreign concept to some, you know, maybe younger people, that there was a time when music wasn't that shareable. And I think that's really an interesting thing to look at, that cultural shift that's happened over the last 40 years.
Yeah, I totally agree. They take it for granted, let's face it. And it's become so prosaic, so commonplace to share music or all sorts of media. And it's hard to convince them just how hard that was at one time. I always talk about my very first mixtape that I ever made. It was in 1986. And I called it Sounds of the City circa 1972. And it was all songs I had heard and loved on the radio when I was young that I remembered and that I collected mostly by going out and buying 45 singles of them, mostly R&B or soul records by Curtis Mayfield and the Shy Lights and the OJs and Sly Stone, people like that, collecting 45s, putting them together on a mixtape, which, let's face it, for a 90-minute tape was a 3 or 4 hour process. And it was a big deal. And nowadays you just drag and drop and make a playlist. So it's nothing at all to them. It's hard to convince them how special, what a kind of scavenger hunt it was to even find music back then, let alone collect it on tape.
Yeah, the process is interesting because the declaration of intent, and then it's the ordering the songs in the right order and finding the songs, and it's actually like the terrifying aspect of giving someone a mixtape. It's a pretty big deal.
And I think to add to that, the level of intentionality, or as you said, Rob, declaration of intent. Now I can go onto a Spotify, put together a playlist of however many songs I want. It can be as long or as short as I want it to be. I can reorder it anytime I want. Whereas cards on the table, I was born in 1987. And so by the time I was really coming of age, it started to become more burning to CD. But I did make some mixtapes early on. And that level of actually having to pick out what you want to put on it ahead of time, put it in the right order, and actually effectively listen to it as you're making it. It takes a lot more time. It takes a lot more effort. And
yes,
intentionality.
It was much more. Yeah, it was much more a curatorial process. You were a curator because you had a certain time frame and you had to make sure that things fit. And you couldn't pick a 17-minute song with a bunch of other things because it's not all going to fit. And you have to like work these things out. And there was an art to it.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. So timing those songs out so it would be about 45 minutes per side. It couldn't be over 45. And ideally not too much under 45 either, right? So because you didn't want a lot of dead air. So there was a lot of work to it, but I think something Anthony is alluding to there is there were rewards to it that I don't think they see today with the drag and dropping or just sharing Spotify playlists. When you collected those songs and when you made that tape and sat down in front of your stereo and put those headphones on and, played and paused the tape while you dropped the tone arm at the appropriate spot on each record, you were listening to those songs that you maybe already loved. You're listening to them kind of anew because you're listening to them with the prospect of whoever you're giving this tape to, how much they're going to love it, which excites you as a mixtaper. There was something really special about that process that, frankly, I really miss. I don't make them anymore, mainly because nobody who I want to give music to really uses cassettes anymore. So it's a lost art.
Can you talk a little bit? I know there's a big thing in the book, but can you kind of talk little bit too about, like everything that happens underground the cassette tape kind of got frowned upon by labels and contemporary licensing
Mhm.
groups and things. Can you just kind of talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I like to look at about 1981 as a kind of tipping point year, kind of watershed period for the cassette, because that's the time when the music labels are launching their campaign, of course, of home taping is killing music and campaigning Congress for a royalty, what they called a royalty, what really would have been a tax or surcharge on all blank tapes and cassette players. So you would have had to pay extra, possibly substantially more if those laws had passed to even buy a blank tape. And their whole line, a lot of the major labels, and especially their lobby, the Recording Industry Association of America, their whole line was that blank tapes would be nothing if it weren't for our music, for our major label music, the music that's being copied with these blank cassettes. Meanwhile, what's happening with blank cassettes? Metallica is releasing their very first recordings on the heavy metal home taping or tape trading network in California. Neil Cooper starts Reach Out International Records in New York, releases the first Bad Brains tape, which sold 100,000 copies in about 10 years. Hip hop, for its first 5 or 6 years in the 70s, there was no vinyl. There was no vinyl until a group from New Jersey, Sugar Hill Gang, made Rapper's Delight. For all those years, hip hop was a live DJing music of park jams and little clubs and rec rooms. And if it were distributed at all, it had to be on homemade tapes via blank cassettes from Maxell or TDK. So it really put the lie to that home taping is theft or home taping is killing music. Some of the most interesting and innovative music at the time was actually being first released or first distributed on cassettes.
Mentioning Metallica brings two thoughts. The first one is something that I wanted to bring up anyway, and that is the importance of cassettes in the DIY culture, the musical culture. And I'm thinking particularly of punk and metal, and certainly because I was around at this time, that rise of speed metal, that whole thing with the really heavy music. That's really the way that scene was proliferated. That's how that music got discovered by listeners who were interested in that kind of thing. And I think that that's so important, the way that cassette has become important to the rise of indie bands who then become major label bands.
That's true. And I know from listening to your podcast that you're a metal fan, and I don't know that world as well as you. I've heard of that heavy metal tape trading network, and I knew that Metallica was a part of it. I'm more familiar with the indie rock world and the whole scene coming out of, for instance, KAOS Radio, which released the Op zine in the early 80s out of Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington. And out of that very same scene, both Bruce Pavitt, who started Subterranean Pop as a zine and then as an alternating cassette compilation / zine. So the very first music released by Sub Pop was on cassette. The very first music, of course, released by K Records, Calvin Johnson's company, who also came out of that scene, was on cassette. So cassette was pivotal for the beginnings of indie rock, for the beginnings of lo-fi, all those things during that period.
Yeah, I remember my very first days doing college radio. Labels would send us the album, and then they'd send us the cassette because studios had cassette players in them. And we'd have to rewind to get where the song, trying to segue 2 songs off of a cassette. I'm that old. But I think there is an interesting correlation with the development both of fanzines and sort of American college radio. Kind of, they all piggybacked each other, right? And I think the cassette sort of became sort of the way of the underground almost. I love in your book how you talk about with Eastern Europe when they could not have free press and they couldn't print things or video record things, the cassette tape being handed off as a sort of an oral description of what was going on was sort of the way to do it. So it's got all these like interesting cultural and historical methodologies to it, which I think is really, really fascinating. I know you touched upon the indie rock of it, but until I read the book, I wasn't really aware of the historical context of the cassette, just sort of like geopolitically and how much people were like trying to squish it.
It's interesting because there's a parallel with home video as well, because in 79, I think it was Universal and Disney were trying to get VCRs made illegal in the US and lost that in the courts. Sony and I forget the name of the other corporation won the case. And I think it's interesting to see the same thing was going on with audio as a medium. And this was just a battle being fought across the board around accessibility to recording platforms.
Yeah, that's a great point, because it was during that same period, the famous, you're referring to the famous Universal Sony case, Universal v. Sony, with their Betamax. And actually, for those bills that I mentioned where the RIAA is trying to get a royalty on blank cassettes and cassette recorders, those were all piggybacking on the Sony Betamax case. So they were trying to get both VCRs, VHS tapes, although at that time Sony released Betamax tapes, and audio cassettes, a royalty on them, but did not succeed, fortunately, in either case.
The other thing that mentioning Metallica made me think of, and this is such an obvious one because it was such a huge thing, but I think that people forget that the Napster thing really goes back to the early cassette era when you did have labels who were emblazoning record covers with home taping is killing music and all that stuff. And I think it's interesting to see Metallica on both ends of this thing, where they are, and of course, they're not like distributing other people's music. They're distributing their own music, but they're using cassettes to do it. And then when you get up to Napster, that whole argument starts over again with downloading music is killing the record industry. And I just think it's interesting to find Metallica on different angles in that argument.
Yeah, there's a lot of irony to that for sure, with Metallica coming at it from different sides. The home taping controversy versus the Napster and downloading and file sharing controversy, they're interesting to compare because they have so much in common. At the same time, you did lose some sound quality with each generation of cassette copies, right? So a lot of music industry types were probably waxing nostalgic for the times when people were just copying to tape, where at least it was a second or third generation copy, right, rather than the perfect digital copy. And the funny thing is that what finally made, is a very interesting factoid that I came across, what finally made home taping legal, in other words, for personal use, analog taping on analog cassette, was a 1992 bill called the Home Audio Recording Act, which was the same bill that made digital taping, digital copying, burdened it not only with royalties, but with copy protection, right? With serial copy management. So every digital medium after 1992 has copy protection, where maybe you can make one copy, but you can't make a copy from that copy. That, I'm sure you'll remember, it was in response to the rise of the digital audio tape, which everybody was talking about, right? 1990, 91, 92. Oh boy, we're going to have these tapes where we could make perfect copies. Well, they managed to head that off and to get those burdened with all sorts of restrictions. The problem was, in that 1992 act, and this is the most interesting part of it, there was an exception for computer companies. Apple campaigned for that exception. They said, what are computers good for as far as copying music? People need to be able to copy things with their computers. We're not going to use that to copy music. Well, within a few years, of course, they're marketing computers with built-in CD burners. So just a fascinating chain of events there. going back to your comment earlier, Rob, yes, in Poland and in Russia and a lot of countries, the cassette really had a political resonance that it didn't always have here, but it was absolutely pivotal during the rise of the Solidarity Labor Union in Poland, during the East German campaign against a political dissonance, for the rise of rock in Russia and political rock in Russia. Cassette was key.
Yeah, it's interesting because you had guys that were recording stuff off of like Voice of America and then shipping that out across, and not just, you know, the news stuff, but also music, right? And it was sort of like, it was like the 50s when they were putting records on X-rays, right? Except they're putting them on cassette tapes, right? It's a sort of continuation of bone music. But one of the things too that I love about cassettes is that so many people of my generation recorded the radio. Like if there's a radio show they liked, or they wanted to tape America's Top 40 or something. And now people have all these cassettes of like these moments, 2 to 3 hour chunks of moments of time. And those are starting to go into archives and being studied as like a thing. So like, I know you go through the origin of cassette tape, but when you were writing the book and you're going through creating Unspooled, were you kind of aware of the historical significance beyond just like people that dig music?
That's a good question. I was definitely aware that taping from the radio was always a big aspect of having a tape player. And I think one of the original audiences, this is maybe getting off of your question to some degree, but one of the original markets for cassette players, and I'm talking about those little mono cassette players like the Norelco Carrycorder that first became popular in the 60s. One of the original markets was kids and tweens who were addicted to top 40 radio and would run down to Woolworths every week when the new singles came out. And suddenly you had this little tape deck. You could just put it in front of your radio for an hour and have every hit of the day on there. And it might be interrupted at the beginning and the end by a DJ like Cousin Brucey or Harry Harrison in New York, where I was. And it might be very low quality, but a lot of kids didn't care. They now own that music and had gotten onto their little cassette decks. But beyond that, I mean, radio became so important for, again, in hip hop. I mean, people would literally record mixes from, master mixes from urban hip hop radio stations in New York and then mix them further, make little pause mixes by themselves on their tape decks. So there were a lot of aspects, a lot of connections between radio and and that's interesting, the archiving, because sometimes you get moments of certain DJs talking that might be rare nowadays.
Yeah, it's also interesting too, because when I was going through Unspooled and reading it, one of the things that I thought about was just how compartmentalized we were as musical listeners then, because we got stuff on the radio, we got stuff at the mall, and sort of what we read about in magazines or maybe zines, but there wasn't a way to like spread music. If Anthony likes a record in London, it took me months or a year to even hear it. Now it's instantaneous, right? And it's really sort of fascinating how the cassette sort of began this culture of making music really transcendental in terms of like being able to just go across physical boundaries and spaces.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because there's a book, and you mentioned the Eastern Europe earlier. And in the 70s, there's a book called Back in the USSR by Artemy Troitsky, I think his name is. And he talks about some of the bands that became popular among some of the American Western bands that became popular among Russian rock fans were like kind of unusual choices, like Rush or whatever. I mean, not nothing against Rush, but not like necessarily the top 70s bands. They just happen to be the bands that were smuggled in by somebody or another on a cassette, and that spread like wildfire in that area of Russia. The cassette did start the trend of music being global or being spreadable in a way it hadn't been. A lot of African artists like Youssou N'Dour, who becomes a household name, once Paul Simon comes out with Graceland and things like that. His original records were on cassette, but mostly spread through pirated copies. But I don't think he would have objected to the fact that students from his homeland were showing up in Paris and London and playing his music or copying his music and giving it to locals there, because it was key in spreading his music around the world, and not just his. A lot of global artists became global through the global spread of cassettes, back before it was possible to do that through the internet.
One of the things that's interesting about the book too is that it is historical without getting weighed down by like all the heavy sort of semantics of like, this is how a cassette works and things. Can you just kind of talk about the research you did to it and sort of how you went about researching for the book and finding out all the stuff you did and things like that?
Yeah, so I'm kind of a catch-as-catch-can researcher, and I'm kind of a muddle-headed researcher. I'll start with one thing and then move on to something completely other. So at the beginning, I was interviewing people. This would have been about 2004 or 2005 or so, who made and shared mixes, and mostly students and people in the area of Michigan where I live. And I just kept hearing from them again, oh, I make mix CDs, but they would still call them mixtapes, and they would say, oh, I just hear about how great tapes were and we make CDs, but I remember some of them remembered making mixtapes when they were younger and so then I moved on to the archival research. And when we say archival research, like a historian, it's just a matter of going to the library or nowadays some internet databases and just reading a lot. So I read, as I was talking about with the hearings earlier, which took place from about 82 to 85, the home taping hearings. That was like 3,000 pages of transcripts of congressional hearings. But just looking through a lot of old zines, there's a library in Bowling Green, Ohio, the Bowling Green State University Music Library, which is one of the very best music libraries in the world. So I spent a lot of time there. The librarian, Bill Shirk there, who's since retired, would basically let me go back in the stacks and just look at stuff rather than having to request things all the time at the desk. And it's just full of old zines and things like that. So I looked through old copies of New York Rocker and Talk and like I said, Op, of course, and just many alternative press. And just before, a lot of it was, some of it has now been digitized, but at that time was just a matter of looking at page after page and looking for discussions of cassettes or of mixtapes. So it took a long time. It was pretty laborious, but a labor of love for sure.
So the process of making the book was sort of like parallel to making a mixtape.
It is. It definitely went from one. Sometimes the segues were a little rough too.
Yeah.
Managed all right.
To shift topic a little bit, I was working in music retail back during the end of the LP era and the rise of cassettes and CDs and all this. And what I noted is that the way the cassettes would change sort of the format of albums, because you weren't necessarily constrained with LPs. You had a hard cutoff with about 24 minutes per side. And with cassettes, you could do more. You could be more flexible with the way that you're putting music out. And there's a couple of examples that I'm thinking of specifically. There's two greatest hits albums, Jefferson Airplane Gold and Yes Classics. And both of them went a little bit beyond the LP time limit. And they did that by including a 45 in the album with 2 extra songs on it. But on the cassette, you could just factor those things into the running order of the album. So you have one song at the end of side 1 and the other one at the end of side 2, where you couldn't have done that in LPs. And I remember there were some albums that you would get, instead of a side 1 and a side 2, you would get the whole album per side. So you would have the whole thing on one side, flip it over, and you get the whole thing on another one. And one of the ones that I'm thinking of, and I don't necessarily remember that this is accurate, but I think it's right in saying that Love Sexy by Prince was one of those ones, because he wanted people to think of that as a single work, not as individual songs, to the point where when the CD came out and eventually when it was first released on iTunes, it was one track. It wasn't divided up into individual tracks for the songs. It was track one is like the 45-minute album. So I think I'm right in remembering that it was released that way on cassette, where the whole album was on side one and then the whole album was on side two. So I think it's interesting the way that cassettes had that effect on recorded music. Double LPs could be on one cassette. So it was interesting to watch that evolve.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because the Prince example is fascinating, because what he's worried about is people disaggregating his album. It's made as an album. It's made to be listened to as an album. This song after this song after this song. And like you say, I remember, you're right, that it was put out on iTunes as one track, even after the CD was one track, where you couldn't skip between tracks.
Yeah.
But as it kind of goes back to mixtaping, which is interesting, because as a mixtaper, you are by necessity disaggregating. So just from the experience as a mixtaper or mix CDs, somebody who burned mix CDs, there was always an internal conflict about, well, I might want to take this song from this CD, but do I really want to isolate that song from that CD or from that record? Because it's so much a part of that record. It'd be like putting a day in the life or something on a mixtape. You just don't do it. Right? So
I did.
Okay. So on one hand, a mixtape is a work of art and a work of agency, where the mixtaper is taking control and reordering things. On the other hand, sometimes it was thought of as a kind of violation, the integrity of an album. I think that was Prince's view.
Mm-hmm. When I used to be in my heyday of mixtapes and mix CDs, the thing that I loved doing was recontextualizing songs, to mix them with other songs by other bands, or from a single artist, mix things from different albums to make them have sort of like a different meaning. And I put a lot of thought into my mix. I was just crazy about it.
I got to say, since you bring that up, that was okay when, like 30 years ago in the early 90s, when I was still in graduate school, and over the course of a year or two, I had all my best research ideas and wrote them down and have been milking them ever since. But that was my first thought about mixtapes, was the way that people create the segues and create a kind of narrative. And even the way sometimes, I'm sure you've experienced this, where you might shuffle a CD or you might put songs randomly onto a tape, but they start to, a narrative starts to develop in your head. Like, oh, I expect to hear this song after that one. And not only do I expect it, but they have a kind of meaning. They develop a kind of meaning together. And that's fascinating stuff. It sort of fell by the wayside in my project, but I still find it interesting.
Another thing that I was a little bit insane about when it came to both CDs and cassettes when I was doing this kind of thing was cover art. And sometimes I would just use the J card that was in the cassette box, in the case itself, and just, not do anything too fancy with it. Maybe draw a logo on the spine or whatever. But there were times when I got really elaborate. And like, I remember one time I was doing a cassette for a friend of Yes Music. And if you took a regular size sheet of notebook paper and fold it in eighths, it almost perfectly fit in the cassette box. And I did this artwork where it was a normal, cassette sized front cover. And then as you unfolded it, all these different layers of a single picture were unfolded, where it was like, the space, it was out in space, and there was a space station, and then the space turned into an ocean, and then there was a whale breaching, so he's like jumping up, and then there's an inverted landscape, so the whale is jumping up into the sky of this other planet, and it was insane. But as you unfolded, there's 8 bits of this single picture, so I was crazy, and I got laughed at, but I loved doing cover art for these things.
Yeah, I was kind of a minimalist. I just put titles and artists. But then I've met people also who, back when I was doing interviews, who wouldn't even put titles and artists because they were like, well, then whoever I give it to is just going to read those things in advance. It's like a spoiler. So don't even put that. Yeah, don't even put that on. It's got to be a surprise. Let them listen. Let them discover what comes after what. And that's the beauty of a mixtape, is you had to listen because it wasn't shuffleable, or you couldn't just skip. You kind of had a captive audience a little bit more, just like artists did when they released albums, when they released music on vinyl albums. You're not going to get up. You could, but you're not going to get up every 5 minutes and move the tone arm to the next song you like. So you listen to the whole record, and then that leads to things like concept albums, right? Well, we had concept mixtapes too. I did want to say, just because I hope that this discussion doesn't sound too Americocentric, because I think a lot of my book does focus on American scenes and that sort of thing, but Europe, Africa, Asia, and Britain especially had an amazing scene of DIY cassette artists and cassette labels. I mean, one of my very favorite cassette artists, or he was for a long time, was Martin Newell, who recorded his Cleaners from Venus,
Yes.
and for years and years refused to join a record company, even though critics were like, how is this guy still on just cassette? I mean, he's great. He sounds like XTC. He sounds like Soft Boys. Why is he cassette artist? He hated being managed. He hated touring. He got panic attacks at the thought of flying. So he just stayed in his hometown of Wivenhoe in the English home counties and worked as a dishwasher and made wonderful music on cassette. So go figure.
The cassette also gave us Wesley Willis.
Elaborate.
Well, I mean, a lot of his recordings, he started doing, he was just recording onto cassette, a lot like Daniel Johnston did. Just sort of like, I'm making cassette. I mean, and I think that's kind of an interesting thing too, is that a lot of these guys that are sort of considered fringe artists, nobody in their right mind would give them an audience or radio play or anything. So like, I'm just going to put a cassette out, and whoever wants it can have it, which is a really powerful thing. And especially around the world, when you've got people in like faraway corners that don't have access to like regular studios and stuff. It's like, it's a way of, not only preserving a culture, but also sort of preserving and fostering creativity. Because these guys are just like, you know what? I don't need a studio. I don't need the conventional parameters of a record label to get my music out. And I think that sort of instilled a lot of what we got in the 90s, where artists were being really resilient to being micromanaged by labels by the end of the 90s. I think that sort of a lot of that comes back to the cassette a little bit. And you talked a little bit about the home taping is killing music thing. Do you think that like sort of that idea of like home cassette recording and stuff like that, and it ties in a lot with some of the stuff that happened? We talk about this a lot with like the PMRC and things like that. Do you think the attempts to sort of censor music came from sort of the proliferation of music on cassette, or do you think they're two separate things that had nothing to do with each other?
Well, I know that I think Tipper Gore was upset about like Prince, who, obviously was releasing music by that time on whatever format he wanted to, or heavy metal, or Twisted Sister, or, so I don't know if that controversy was a little later. It was around 85 that they had those hearings. So it was a few years after the home taping hearings. it was equally interesting, but I think of a little different valence just because it was all about, censorship and explicit lyrics and things like that. I don't think they went after cassette artists that much because I don't think there were many cassette artists that were worth going after to them. They were, cassettes were considered such a small time medium. So what they were worried about were the most popular artists who happened to have lyrics that they found objectionable.
Which is funny because like Two Live Crew and PE and NWA got a lot of their starts with like cassette music, which is kind of funny.
Sure. That is
when
true.
we were all worried about Two Live Crew.
Yeah.
That's a threat to democracy. What do you think the people today that do music sharing, what have they learned from cassette culture, basically by osmosis or research, and what are they missing?
I think there is a consciousness of it. It's kind of amazing how the image of a cassette itself has become so iconic and so totemic, and you see it on coffee mugs and you see it on t-shirts, and so obviously it resonates at some level, I think, with a lot of younger people. And we know that there are an awful lot of young bands who are releasing music on cassette, sometimes only on cassette. First of all, because it's a lot cheaper than vinyl. You don't have to get a pressing of 1,000 copies or 500 copies and wait 6 months or more because you're waiting for the Taylor Swift vinyl to be pressed before yours can. There's a company, National Audio in Springfield, Missouri, that makes their living from copying cassettes for young bands mostly. So those people are definitely aware of it. So many young bands and young artists, from kind of indie artists to noise artists, who release music on cassettes, often because of the feeling that there's just such a digital glut now that the idea of releasing a cassette and people listening to it all the way through without, skipping to something else or hypertexting to something else is very appealing. Now, it's an open question, by the way, I think, how many people actually listen to those cassettes that they buy at merch counters, at shows and such, because I'm not sure how many of those buyers even have tape players anymore. I think sometimes they're just kind of Instagram fodder, or just something to display on your shelf, or just something to make a $5 contribution to a band you love. But they're out there, and they don't seem to be going away. Olivia Rodrigo will probably sell 20 or 30,000 copies of her latest record on cassette. Not nearly as many as vinyl or as streaming, but there it is.
But with the resurgence that vinyl has had over the last 12-ish, 15-ish years, do you think there'll ever come a time when we'll see that same thing happen with cassettes?
I honestly don't, to tell you the truth. I like to be an advocate for it, but I'm being just realistic, just in terms of sound quality,
right?
Yeah, and people's realistic expectations. When push comes to shove, I think people are willing to play vinyl at home because of all the merits that everybody talks about, its warmth and all. But when they go out, if they can listen to it on their phones, they're probably going to do that rather than carrying around a clunky personal stereo that's not nearly as good as the Sony Walkmans that Sony stopped making in 2010. So I don't know if it'll ever be nearly. People talk about a revival and they talk about percentage year-to-year increases, but that's from a very small base. So I don't think even 1 million tapes are sold in this country yet every year. And now there's 1 billion vinyl records being sold. Vinyl sells better than CDs. So it's just a different order of magnitude.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think what's interesting from that perspective is I look at what my parents did with their collections. They held on to their vinyl from the 60s, 70s, and early 80s. They upgraded their cassettes onto CD when CD became a thing. they still use CDs because they are now in their 60s and 70s and haven't quite got their arms around this newfangled internet thing. But I always thought that was very interesting how they held on to their vinyl, but not their cassette tapes.
Yeah.
That's true. Same for me.
I do think one thing that led to slightly longer tenure for cassette than may have otherwise been realistic was probably cars. Right? I don't know how it was here, but CDs became, I don't know, when CDs were mid to late 80s when they really became popular. Up until 2008, we had a tape player in the car and not a CD player, and it wasn't really until the late 2000s, early 2010s that CD players came as standard in cars. And the amount of time between CDs becoming standard equipment versus Bluetooth so you can connect your phone or what have you, CD may as well have been a blip in the automotive listening experience. So I was, up until, I want to say 2008, making mixtapes for the car.
Yeah.
And I always thought that was really interesting. Aside from use in the automobile, tapes had become more or less obsolete by that stage, but people were still using them in their cars.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Tape decks came standard in a lot of cars until late aughts or early 2010s, and that was long after most people were listening to them otherwise. And I still have a little device at home, probably you guys may too, and I have an affection for it. It's like a cassette-shaped thing with a cord coming out of it that you can plug into an iPod. Yeah. So
the other interesting thing I wanted to ask you about, Rob, just because you're probably more knowledgeable about this than I am. Alan and Rob L are well aware of my love for the artist Steven Wilson, who has become a very, very successful producer doing lots of Atmos remixes. But he, as a kid, kind of preteen / teenager, was really got into experimenting with music and production and sound more than anything. And one of the kind of early experiments that sent him down the production path later in his life was he would do things like unspool tapes, physically cut them, and splice tape together. I was wondering if that was something you'd kind of heard a lot of eventual producers doing, really experimenting with the media in that way, or if that was something that was actually fairly unusual and he was just an odd child.
Well, that is interesting. I think people always did a lot with magnetic tape in general, probably even more with reel-to-reel tape, with the old reel-to-reel tape. Walter Murch, I just know a story about him because I read it in his biography. He is basically the premier sound designer in Hollywood for years and years. He basically invented the field of sound design. He got started when he was about 12. He lived in the Bronx. He had a neighbor who had a tape recorder, and he borrowed it from him. And he would do things like put the mic under a metal lampshade and beat on the lampshade, and then he'd put the mic in one end of a tube from a vacuum cleaner and yell down the other end. So, doing strange things with tape, or splicing, like you say, or so many experiments with tape. I think also of William Basinski's experiment, famous, the disintegration tapes, which was around the time of the 9/11 incidents. Yes. Yeah, I mean, they're spooky to listen to because basically he took these tape loops, these loops of very short segments of tape that he had, and just played them over and over until the coating starts to chip away from and the sound just disappears. And it sounds kind of like decay and death. It's kind of like that film Decasia of the old decaying films from So there are so many ways you can do interesting things with tapes. It's not really my expertise, but it was it was very important to music concrete. It was very important to experimental music movements in general back in the 50s and 60s, magnetic tape and its material potential, its material possibilities.
Interesting. Thank you.
I gotta say the wording of about the hissing in the book is pretty fantastic. Like it's the riff on the Hall of Notes is like your hiss is all I miss.
Oh, thank you.
Wow.
That's a book chapter for the conclusion on the revival. Your hiss is what I miss. I think people do. I think people do miss that hiss a little bit. Again, I'm not sure we'd want to live with it every day for every one of the recordings we listen to. But again, there is a materiality to that hiss. Yeah. And there are some modern kind of noise artists and interesting avant-garde artists who release music to cassette and take advantage of that hiss.
Yeah, when we were getting sort of ready for this, in addition to jumping into the book, I went through old mixtapes and started listening to them. And the hiss totally, I'm like, why did I not notice this before? Why did I, as a listener, like not be offended that there was this like hiss? And then how long would I wait until, it was the age-old question, like, how long do you wait before you start recording? And then what happens when it stops before the song ends? Do you have to start all over? I mean, there's all these like little parts of this culture that people don't understand anymore. It's just, it's kind of interesting. How much, which leads me to this, how much of this sort of tape revival do you think is nostalgia, and how much of it is actually like academic?
Is academic?
Yeah, because there's a lot. I mean, your book is sort of like one of like just a bunch of books about cassettes that have come out in the last year or so, right? Yeah. So it's like it's sort of this area now that people are sort of studying, right, as they sort of jump into the 80s and things. But also we still love this sort of nostalgia of like, oh, I'm making a mixtape. It's sort of like this glamorous thing sort of now, right? So I guess the big thing sort of going back to that chapter and stuff is kind of the role of nostalgia and academia and all that, sort of studying all this and being fond of it.
Yeah. And, again, it was about 2009, 2010, 2011 when journalists started to write little think pieces on, the cassette is coming back, and indie bands are making cassettes again. And this, like in Pitchfork, things like that. Mark Hogan wrote a really good piece around 2009 in Pitchfork on this. By then, I was well into my research, so my book is the result of research which goes back before the revival and before even cassettes went out of fashion. But there's been other great work lately on cassettes, definitely. And I've been following it avidly because I think to some degree it's coincidental, but Mark Masters had his great book, High Bias, just this past year, which is really kind of a survey of all of cassette history as a music medium. Mine's more focused on the indie world, a little more academic. There's also a terrific book, we haven't gotten into this at all, by John Brackett called Live Dead, which of course was one of the very first live releases of the Dead was called Live Dead. So it's basically the evolution of the Dead's live sound, and especially how all the tapers, the bootleggers, the taper section, how that all played into it. So that's a really fascinating subtext of cassette history that I didn't get into, but John's book is great on that.
All right. Well, we are just about out of time, so we're going to take a very quick break, and then we are going to be right back to wrap up our show. So don't go anywhere.
Hi, I'm Joe Heath.
And I'm Tony Heath.
And we're the hosts of the Watchathon of Rassilon,
a podcast where we used to talk about all of classic Doctor Who.
But we finished all of that.
So now we're talking about New Who.
Well, old New Who.
Right, the Russell T Davies era.
Well, the old Russell T Davies era.
Yeah, the David Tennant stuff.
Well, the old David Tennant stuff.
The Watchathon of Rassilon.
Your podcast for old, new, and old new Doctor Who.
All right, we're back. Rob, or I should say Mr. Drew, just so we're all clear which Rob I'm addressing. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. This was a fascinating discussion that I've been looking forward to for weeks now. So I really appreciate you being on and talking to us about this topic.
It's a real pleasure. Thank you very much.
Just out of curiosity, what's on your playlist now? What do you listen to?
Speaking of the Grateful Dead, which we just were, I've developed this weird penchant for jam bands, which I never had. I'm actually, as we speak, in upstate New York. I live in Michigan, but upstate New York, around where I am, is jam band heaven. I literally went to a Dead cover band show in a nearby town here. It's in the Orange County, Rockland County area. But yeah, I've been listening to some Mo and stuff that I never would have listened to until recently. My brother is a big fan, and I think I'm just sort of trying to connect with him through it partly, but that's what I've been listening to lately.
And for our listeners, tell us one more time about the title of the book, where they can buy the book, and where they can follow you on the socials or wherever for more information.
Yeah, thank you. My book is Unspooled, subtitle How the Cassette Made Music Shareable. It's available from Duke University Press. And yeah, I'm on Twitter, Facebook, mostly those two. I think it's Slopster 48602, I think is my Twitter handle. Not that anybody uses Twitter anymore. I don't know.
Right.
Given the ownership structure, but it is what it is.
All right, Anthony, where can people find more about you?
As always, you can also find me on Watchers in the Fourth Dimension, a podcast where we are watching our way through all of Doctor Who from 1963 until now. We are at the tail end of the Tom Baker era, having just wrapped up season 16. As always, you can find us wherever you like to get your podcasts, including Spotify, Amazon, iHeartRadio, etc., including wherever you're listening to this one. So please do check us out. You can catch us on the socials at Watchers4D on Instagram and Facebook, and also the platform formerly known as Twitter. And also, if anyone wants to follow me personally, I'm on Instagram at Englishman in ATL.
All right, Rob, Mr. Levy, you have the next 10 minutes to lay out all of your various projects. So take it away.
You can find me on Facebook and Instagram and the aforementioned platform that shall not be named under my name. You can find it there. On the socials, I also have a real radio, like that you turn the knobs on, radio show on KDHX called Juxtaposition. That this week is the end of year 29, but the start of year 30 is actually, oh my God, today. So 29 years ago.
Happy birthday.
Yeah. So we started doing the show 29 years ago. And that's every Wednesday from 7 to 9 Central Time. It's archived at kdhx.org for 2 weeks. So you can listen to it later if you have stuff to do and whatever. I also do a show on Louder Than War Radio out of Manchester. That's John Robb's little radio empire. And that's called Antics. That's Mondays from 6 to 8 Greenwich Time, 12 to 2 Central, 1 to 3 Eastern at Louder Than War Radio. All of the previous 67 editions of that are available on their Mixcloud page. And then I just started doing a couple months ago a show on the Face Radio in Brooklyn called The Free Design. And if you go to thefaceradio.com, you can go there and check out that show, which is on Mondays from 5 to 7 Central, 6 to 8 Eastern. And it repeats on Tuesdays from 7 to 9 a.m. Central and 8 to 10 Eastern. And I've gotten really great at time zones. So that's where you can find me.
All right. And I just have one little place that you have to go to find all my crazy nonsense, and that is cosmiccreative.com, KOZMIC creative.com. You can check out my books, you can check out my other podcasts, and that's about it. So we are going to be back in 2 weeks, and we are going to be doing a review of, and this is way overdue. We've meant to do this for ages now, and things kept getting in the way of it. But we are going to do a review of the 40th anniversary re-release of Stop Making Sense, the greatest concert film ever released, and that being the Talking Heads, of course. And we've got a lot of cool stories to tell about that. So join us in 2 weeks for Stop Making Sense. Thank you all so much for listening. We appreciate it. If you have any feedback for us or would like to chime in on your experience with cassette history or home taping or mixtapes or all that stuff, just drop us a line at modernmusicology1@gmail.com or just drop us a note on any of our socials.
Very quickly before we hang up, I do just want to point out there is a slight continuity of topic between today's show and our next one, given how David Byrne starts out that concert by walking on stage with a portable cassette player.
That's so true. If only we had planned it that way.
Shush, Alan, just pretend that we did.
Oh, sure. Yeah, that's the way to go. All right, everybody, take care. Have a great week, and we will be back in 2 weeks. See you then.
This has been a broadcast of the ESO Network. Be part of the crew and help support our shows by donating to our ESO Patreon or by shopping at the TeePublic store, which can all be found at www.esonetwork.com. The ESO Network, your station for all things geek.